it's just a good thing for you to go ahead and volunteer when I ask, because my wife's a therapist and I can outwit you. I can just sit here. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I liked the note that you made from the Google study where you can get 80% of your information from 5 people. That feels very doable for a lot of different experimentation. So I really appreciated that.
Yeah. Yeah. If you think about this, very, very often what I try to say to people is there's kind of like two 80-80 principles. One is you can get about 80% of your data from 5 diverse voices. Don't get like the same small group. If you get like 5 people from the choir, you're going to get the same 5 answers. But so 5 diverse voices can give you about 80% of the information you want. And the other thing to think about is when we get 80% clarity is when we want to start trying stuff. Don't wait for 100. Like if you get to 80%, if you feel like there's an 80%, this is a yes, as long as it's not going to bring the whole church down. Again, safe, modest, right? Safe, modest experiments. We have about an 80%. 80%. We think this is going to be a good idea. 80%. That's pretty. You can learn a lot from that. What I call the 80-80 principle. Good. Number 2. Who's the second person? Question, inspiration, inquiry. Good. Please.
I think one of the good insights is like what we learned from the experience from our tryings.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes we are so focused in get that right.
Yes.
No, we are spending time. We are spending money. We are spending like our volunteers' energy. So, and it didn't work. But I think in the other way, we can just see like, oh, what do you learn from that? And that would be better for the future. Yeah,
thank you. Good. Yeah, it's to all of a sudden realize, just think of this. We don't have to have 100% certainty, and we don't have to make it work, because those aren't our goals. Our goals are to learn what we can and to get really curious about learning things that we don't know. And I'll give you one more illustration about this. One of the I have spent quite a bit of the last, you'll notice in my next presentation, spent the last several years learning a lot more about the civil rights movement in the United States. It's one of the most powerful experiences, of course, is to study the Montgomery bus boycott, where Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat, created the Montgomery bus boycott. That boycott went a year, right? We're going to talk about this a little bit later. A year of holding people together who mostly needed public transportation to be able to get to work, saying to them, we're going to keep this boycott going for a year. Dr. King was 26 years old. Anybody in the room 26 or younger? Could you imagine being the person responsible for holding 100 people, for a year holding people together? Like, imagine that, right? 26 years old. Right, it's stunning, right? So when it finally, the bus boycott ended, of course, when the Supreme Court struck down bus segregation. So Thurgood Marshall, who is one of my heroes, later said to Dr. King, you know, you did all that walking for nothing. What you needed to do is just file a lawsuit with the courts. Let the courts do their job. Okay? The technical solution is for the courts to do its job, and it did. But I actually don't think that walking was for nothing, because what that walking did for that year was taught folks who became the leaders of the civil rights movement how to do nonviolent direct civil action that led the civil rights movement for the next 2 decades. All that walking was about training. So one of the things to recognize is when we're doing these experiments, when we're doing prototypes, when we're listening to people in the community, just get your people to do interviews in the community. That will change them. Like, just get them. Get outside the door. Go talk to somebody. You're going to notice they're going to do stuff like, do we have to talk to people we don't know? Like, everybody gets nervous, right? Just say, look, just talk to 4 people who don't go to this church. Extra credit if they're not Christians, right? And ask them these 3 questions. And start noticing what happens when you start listening to people. And the more you listen to people, the more you become aware of these pain points. And when you start trying prototypes, you actually learn even more. And the focus of learning begins to transform stuff. And the more that you get focused on learning, the more the possibility. That's how the shifts happen. The shifts in values happen. The shifts in habits, behavior. Like when I start recognizing that very often I get flown into places to talk about adaptive leadership, and no one in the room is going to actually do anything about it. What I learn is I'll sell some books and I'll get a speaking fee. What I'm really interested in is coming back and working with a group of people who want to actually try stuff. It's way more interesting for me to be here than for me to be with some big group that just wants to have the person who's an author of a book. Because what actually makes stuff happen is you trying stuff. You can, as you learn as you go, right? Okay, one more. It's the Jeopardy theme song in my bad voice.
I think one of the things you mentioned earlier was the asking question without imposing your agenda.
Yeah.
That really, because oftentimes, we ask questions, but we already have something in the back of our mind. It's kind of like you ask questions, you just want to have them say what they want to say, but you already have something planned out. Yeah.
What has happened to you when you've asked questions? What happens to you internally when you ask questions where you don't know the answer? I actually was asking you specifically. Yeah. You thought it was rhetorical.
I thought it was rhetorical. You're looking,
exactly
okay,
right.
You're giving
No,
me this,
like you said, you had this aha moment, right? Mm-hmm. So what happens to you when you start finding yourself asking questions where you don't know the answer? What happens to you?
The learning experience.
Yeah. Do you get energized by it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
Well, you get challenged by it also.
Yeah.
It depends on the answer, right?
Yeah, exactly right. Well, and I got to tell you, for me, I get challenged even to ask the question. I realize I'm afraid of asking dumb questions. Yeah, I just get so I have one of the thanks for taking my follow-up question. One of the people in my I had a consultant in my church. He was of a big Fortune 100 companies, like massive companies, all the famous ones you know. And he was great because he used to have this phrase he would say whenever we were like arguing over something and someone's going, you know what we should do, or you know what we should have the pastor do, or you know what we should have the staff do, or you know what you should do. He would go, every time he sighed, everybody stopped. He'd say, there's a really good question in here somewhere, and I don't know what it is. And that phrase made us all go, what's the question we should be asking? Instead of, what's the solution we should be trying to find? The next thing you start asking better questions, and you start realizing that asking better questions leads you into places that you've never seen before. Then you get energized, right? My gosh, we're discovering these things, we're seeing these things. But it's literally overcoming that. And some of us may come from families where, just pay attention to this. Next time you're in a family gathering, count the number of times anybody asks a question. I think my family didn't ask a question for 12 years. I think that we were really good at pontificating, giving advice, somebody would say something, and here's what I think, here's what I think. It's amazing a skill set about learning how to ask questions. Okay, thank you for that. Okay, we're going to talk about what's now called the most important aspect of leadership. The most important aspect of leadership. Okay, so here's what we think about this. This is what we're going to talk about. So the process goes like this. You start with your charism. Here's who we are. This is what's important about us. This is our values. This is our gift. We start with the healthiest version of ourselves. We know that not everything's healthy, but we start with the healthiest version of ourselves. We also know that when we discover our charism, we get pretty in touch with the things that are not so great. There's things we're going to have to probably want to change or get rid of. We're going to think about the pain point. What is calling for our charism? What's the voice calling for us out there? What's the pain out there? What's the thing that gives us a burden, wakes us up, makes us worry about things, right? That pain point. And that when we move charism to pain point, we're going to end up moving toward transformation. And it's in transformation that we get resistance. Everybody's excited to tell stories. You say, hey, we're going to do a storytelling experience. Everybody's excited. Matter of fact, I would just say this. If your church is not excited about telling stories, you're probably more or closer to death than you think. It's almost a sign of a church that's given up hope. It doesn't want to tell the stories because it feels too painful. Like I had one of my students, actually, we discovered this, a doctoral student, we actually said, go tell stories. And he wrote me and said, Dr. Bolsinger, I can't get anybody to show up for storytelling. I've done it 3 times. I said, I actually think your church is probably closer to dying. Let's assume this is a marker that they don't want to change. And it was true. They didn't want to change. They were a church that was going to die. But mostly, people really enjoy telling stories. And people can get energized. They're intimidated, but they get energized about pain points, right? You can find people who will pound the table. The problem in this thing is there's not enough stuff for kids, or the school systems are terrible, or people will have things that they care about. It's when we have to make change that we run into problems, right? That's where the resistance is. So if you're developing adaptive capacity, clarify the congregational charism, listen for the pain points of the communities, conduct modest experiments, and then discern how will we faithfully need to adapt, change, and grow to become a congregation that can meet the pain points of the community. So over lunch, I had somebody ask me, what if you just get in here and discover it's not really about a adaptive change, it's about stuff like our organizational health. Some of it might just actually be really technical stuff, right? That's still transformation. It just starts with, you have to start on the map before you go off the map. So I had one pastor say to me, he was asked if he could have a coaching consultation with me. He was going into his sabbatical. He said, I really want to talk to you about the way COVID impacted me and what I need to think about and discern for my own going forward. So can I get a call with you? So he did. I had a coaching call with him. And this is what he told me. He said, I'm a pastor of an 8,000 member church in the South. We grow this church. I've been with that church for over 31 years. And over COVID, I watched the way my people talk to each other on Facebook, and I wonder if I have wasted my life. They are vile to each other. Vile, that was the phrase he used, vile to each other. He went away on sabbatical, came back and retired. What he began to recognize is this crisis revealed that as they just hit the crisis itself revealed that they were not as Christian as they thought they were, and he just did not have the fire in the belly to take them through the transformation they needed to go through, and it was time for him to retire and step away. What is the deeper underlying thing we have to work on? How can we faithfully adapt, change, and grow? It might be that we got to get healthy. It might mean that we got to acknowledge some of the things in our past. Oftentimes we get asked when we do consulting to come in during pastoral transitions, where, if you've had a pastor leave and a new pastor is coming, very often the church wants to let's get a search committee, let's get a new pastor, the new pastor will solve it. If you don't take advantage of that moment to look at those deeper underlying issues, to ask those questions, to do this kind of process, what ends up happening is the new pastor comes in and discovers, oh my gosh, there's all these things that nobody told me about. There's all these things they didn't know. There's all these things we haven't acknowledged. And then they become the unintentional interim. So the process of transformation requires doing this work. Not only reveals the adaptive changes we need to make, but it also reveals the underlying need for health that we need to make. And that, which leads us to the fifth one, which is then face the resistance and sabotage with resilience, which is where we head now. Remember, leadership is disappointing your own people at a rate they can absorb. Whenever we're leading people, we are taking them where they resist going. That's what makes leadership happen, right? The reason why they spent 40 years in the wilderness was not because they were lost, but because they needed to be transformed. And the people resist the transformation. Ed Friedman, who wrote the most about this, said when he was asked why pastors burn out, he was asked this during the 1980s, back in the 1980s. They had become so focused on the aches and pains in the system that they'd been thrown off course by the complaints. They had stopped supplying vision or had burnt out fighting the resistance. They had ceased to be the strength in the system. In short, they had forgotten to lead. Sounds like we're talking about Star Wars. What we learn is the aches and pains in the system, the complaints. Pretty soon what happens is we're answering to the complaints and we're not leading the mission. We're responding to the complaints. One of my clients literally said to me, Todd, no matter what I say on Sunday morning, on Monday my inbox is a terrible place to be. When it becomes that toxic, when people are that anxious, when they're that resistant to change, remember, it's not about that they are bad people. It's that the process of going through change is experienced as loss. People experience it as loss. People don't resist change, they resist loss. So remember this. I said this to you last time, but I always think about this. Remember that the root word for family and familiar is the same root word. So when you take people into some place where they feel unfamilied, maybe that's a church that prides itself on being a family, and you bring in new people who don't feel like they're part of the family. Or maybe it's you ask them to do something that doesn't feel like something that our family would do. Or maybe it's just they step into an unfamiliar territory. They feel unfamilied, which means that you don't just feel disrupted or disoriented, you feel abandoned. Just remember, some little kid thinking about the best thing for my birthday is I'm going to spend the day at Disneyland. If they lose mom and dad on Main Street, it's not the happiest place on earth until they run home to mama. Then they can enjoy it again. That's what happens in this change. You are taking people into unfamiliar territory, and they're going to resist and they're going to complain. So when we talk about adaptive changes and the spirit of adventure, we recognize that it requires learning. That's one of the things we know. We've talked a lot about that. It requires learning. It also results in loss. You're going to have to let some stuff go. If your entire identity was built that you are on this adventure because it's a canoe trip, and you're going to canoe and find a water route from America to the Pacific Ocean like Lewis and Clark. If you go on a canoe trip and someone tells you that there's no water route, the Rocky Mountains are in the way, and you can't canoe over them, if you came on this trip because it's a water trip and you built the boats with your own hands, or you even invented a boat, they invented a boat, and all of a sudden you've discovered that you're facing mountains and not rivers, you're going to have to drop the boats. It's a really bad day. Because not only are you no longer going to be on a water trip, which is what you expected to be on, but your identity takes a hit. You're no longer the expert water navigator. You're some dude who carries luggage. And that's not what you signed up for. Requires learning, results in loss, and reveals resilience. Let's talk about resilience this afternoon for just a bit, and I'll do my best to try to keep you awake. Because that was yummy, and yet I can feel myself getting tired. Resilience is the capacity to maintain core purpose and integrity in the face of dramatically changed circumstances. That's my favorite quote on resilience. Lots of good books on resilience right now. It's a perfect time. If you're interested in the study of resilience, lots of good books. Resilient Pastor, Resilience written by SEALs. Not our SEALs, but Navy SEALs. Like Resilience written by, all kinds of books. Here's my favorite quote on resilience, and it comes from Andrew Zolli, who wrote about nations that needed to be resilient. Like, how do you recover from genocide if you're Rwanda? And he says it's this: resilience is the capacity to maintain core purpose and integrity in the face of dramatically changed circumstances. I always tell people, if you spend more than 10 minutes with me, you know that I'm not a maintain guy. Maintain isn't exactly a verb that gets me out of bed in the morning. I'm not interested in, I really want to maintain something today. I'm a catalyze, change, innovate kind of guy. Except maintaining core purpose. What's our mission? What's our reason for being? Who are we? Why are we even here? Maintaining that. Maintaining integrity. What's our values? How do we do it? What are we about, and how do we go about doing it? Those are hugely important. And what Andrew Zolli was saying is when you're in a time of deep disruption, that's what gets lost. That's what Edwin Friedman was saying. When the aches and pains in the system, when people are pushing back against you, when they're struggling with you about this, what gets lost is the most important things. We lose our mission. We were founded by people who had a deep love for the gospel. And next thing you know, we're sitting around arguing whether or not we're going to use drums in church. We were started by folks who said there are people out there who need the love of Christ, and we're going to sacrifice. And now we're sitting around talking about, well, is the service going 15 minutes too long? Right? We losing our core purpose, or we start sacrificing our integrity, our values. Maybe we should compromise this or compromise that. Maybe we don't need to be as welcoming or as loving or as hospitable, because quite frankly, isn't really the church shouldn't it really focus on its members who've given the most around here? Resilience is trying to maintain that core purpose and integrity in the face of dramatically changed circumstances. That's what gets lost when you have the aches and pains in the system, when you have the complaints that throw you off. One of my clients said to me, Todd, I don't worry about whether I can learn to lead change. I worry about whether I can survive it. And that's the experience we have when we start bringing change. Internally, something goes wrong. I was sitting with a couple the other day, a married couple where the husband's talking about the changes they needed to do in the church, and the wife literally was sitting there with him and said to him, can I just say something? This is making me nervous, and I'm having a hard time saying, I really believe in what he does. He's a really good pastor, and I believe in everything he said, and I believe what you're saying. But here's the thing I need you to know. I just keep thinking we got 3 kids to put through college. I know. Right? I know. Wonder if I can survive this. What they're talking about is what Ed Friedman calls sabotage. Edwin Friedman was a Jewish rabbi. Remember I talked about him last time? He led a synagogue for 40 years outside of Washington, D.C. He was also a marriage and family therapist. He did therapy with families, but he was what's called a family systems therapist, which meant that if your son is struggling with grades or drugs, the whole family came to therapy because it wasn't about just the person who's the patient. It's about the whole family system. He believed a Bowenian family systems, Murray Bowen created family systems. Bowenian family systems theory is the best way to think about how to think about healthy congregations. Think about the church as a family system. It says sabotage is part of every family system. So he wrote, the capacity of a leader to be prepared for, to be aware of, and to learn how to skillfully deal with sabotage may be the most important aspect of leadership. It's literally the key to the kingdom. Most important aspect of leadership, which is why, of course, in seminary, you get a year on sabotage, right? You get a year on church history, a year on biblical exegesis, and a year on sabotage. No, you don't. Nobody ever talks about sabotage. Sometimes the only thing about sabotage at our whole school is my lecture on it. If you're a leader, expect sabotage. One more. The important thing to remember about the phenomenon of sabotage is that it is a systemic part of leadership. A systemic part of leadership. It's part and parcel of the leadership process. Another way of putting this is that a leader can never assume success because he or she has brought about a change. It's after having first brought about a change and then subsequently endured the resultant sabotage that the leader can feel truly successful. So let me explain to you how this works. You may have heard me say this before. This is the way we Presbyterians believe theologically the Holy Spirit brings change. We believe in something that's called reformed and always reforming. And here's how the Holy Spirit brings genuine change to the church. It happens this way. If the Holy Spirit is going to inspire change, it's probably going to come through a small group of people who decide to take on the responsibility for discerning the voice of the Spirit in that way. We're going to call that a committee. A committee of people are put together to take on a problem. They're going to study it, they're going to talk about it, they're going to research it, they're going to come back, and they're going to come up with a solution that they believe might be led by the Spirit to change that, but they know they don't have any authority to do it. So they've got to give their idea to a group of people who have the authority to make the change, and they put that in an ancient form called a motion. So the committee makes a motion that goes to the discerning body. The discerning body comes together in a gathering where they're going to discern the work of the Spirit, and they're going to do so using an ancient technique called Robert's Rules of Order. And the committee has a motion with Robert's Rules of Order. You have a discussion, and eventually you use the final ancient technique to discern the work of the Spirit, and it's called a vote. And if you get one vote more than the majority, you get Pentecost. The Holy Spirit falls at that moment because we got to change. That's how change happens in our system. What Friedman says is this, and then the next thing that happens is you get sabotage. Sabotage comes after the change. So I work with leaders all the time, and this is when it dawns on them, oh, they brought me here to be the change. We would like to reach people of color, and I happen to be the first person of color ever in the life of the church. We want to reach younger people, so they brought me in as a younger pastor. We want to do. Oh, you brought me to do this, and now I go. And if you want to do it, we're going to have to do this. And they go, no. They voted you in, and now everything is no. They've got you here. They've given you a housing allowance and a stipend, and your kids in the school, and you got best friends, and it's great, and now everything is no. That's sabotage. Sabotage is normal, it's natural, and it's to be expected. Sabotage is not the bad things that evil people do. but the human things that anxious people do. It's normal, it's natural, it's to be expected. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. We haven't even started prototyping yet. We haven't even talked to anybody outside the church yet. We're going to go do that. And here's what I'm telling you. When you do that, you're going to be sabotaged. It's normal. It's natural. It's to be expected. It's not the bad things that evil people do. It's the human things that anxious people do. When you start pushing people to change, they get anxious. It feels unfamiliar. They want to go back to the familiar. They feel unfamilied. They sabotage. Now, here's what I also know. Just having talked about this, there are probably some of you who are like, oh, that's what happened. I've already been through this. Or my family's been through this, or I watched a pastor go through this, or a friend go through this. Oh my gosh, that's what that was. We didn't call it that, but that's exactly what it was. We started down this road. We started with some ideas. We got excited. We started some new things, and then this happened. So here's what I want you to do. I want to give you a moment to talk about this with each other before we give you any more. I want you to remember this and care for each other. I want you to be careful about the fact that these things can be hard. So here's what I want you to do. If you've got a few minutes, I'll give you just about, I'm looking at the clock, I'm going to give you about 7 minutes around your table. No, I'm going to give you 10. I'll give you 10 minutes around your table. If you have a story that you say, now this is sabotage. Oh my gosh, I have this experience. What I want you to do is briefly tell the story, just briefly, and then talk about how it impacted you and how it impacted your leadership. Just name it so that you can share it together, just so that you feel like we're all in this together. Name it and just talk about how it impacted your leadership.